Hi guys, my name is Samantha. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be reacting to this video by Blaire White titled The Downfall of the Trans Community. They effed around and they found out. In her video, Blaire talks about, what's going on with the trans community right now under this new Trump administration and basically blames it all on trans people.
Everyone wants me to speak on, Trump's moves in the first few weeks of his new administration. Again, I feel like they're deserved.
So today's video is going to be for anybody who might have seen Blaire's video, more than anything, just to give you guys, an alternative perspective. Because, I mean, first of all, a lot of what she said is just simply not true, or it's contradictory to other things she said in this video. So yeah, if you're coming from Blaire's channel or anything like that, just hear me out, okay? Just give me a second. Let me explain. Like I said, my name is Samantha Lux. I post new videos twice a week here on my channel. So if you guys are not yet subscribed and you would like to be, go ahead and do that right now. Go ahead. I'll wait for you. Go ahead. Are you done? Thank you very much. Make sure to follow me over on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all those different places. I stream video games live on my Twitch channel every single week, or at least as often as I can. Finally, I want to say a thank you to all of my current patrons. You guys really help make this work possible. So yeah, thank you. But with no further ado, let's get right into Blaire's video.
Is this the part where I say, I told you so? Because I'm feeling like it's the part where I say, I told you so. And I am not gonna hold your hand when I say this, because protecting people's feelings is actually how we got here. Trump has truly, in the first 2 weeks, met the cultural temperature's energy and taken aim at the trans excesses, the excesses that have come out of trans ideology and the movement over the past decade or so, and rightfully so.
It will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
But even more relevant than the legal backlash is definitely the cultural backlash that's occurring right now that I have been screaming about from the rooftops and warning about for the past decade. Backlash against the community right now, of course, never anything violent or unconstitutional, but the cultural attitudes toward the community right now is 100% deserved. This video is for anybody who's still confused about how we got here. This is how the trans community sabotaged their own movement. First, it's extremely important to understand that it wasn't always this way. The trans community was radically different even just a decade ago when I started my transition in 2015. Now, to set the stage, 2015, gay marriage had just been legalized. There was a complete societal consensus of, at worst, indifference and at best, complete support of gay people and gay marriage. And trans people, being the T in LGBT, enjoyed pretty much all of the blanket support that the rest of the community was getting. At this time, I chose super naively to go to a trans support group because I felt like, if I'm starting this is a new thing for me. I want to maybe seek advice or like camaraderie with people going through the same thing. And what I found was myself at a round table in a transgender support group with about 15 to 20 other people, all of them identifying as some form of non-binary, gender fluid, or some other. There was a politicization and a takeover happening of what used to be treated as a medical condition. Comparing Google search trends for the word transsexual or even transgender to words like non-binary, misgendering, gender fluid, etc., is the best way to see this exact moment when the takeover happened.
Please do not be fooled by this. Non-binary people have not taken over the trans community. They've not infiltrated the trans community or anything like that. And I actually do agree that we as a community have been abducted and politicized, however, not by trans activists. First of all, these screenshots of the Google Trends pages are extremely manipulative. She's leaving out multiple things. First of all, she's leaving out the fact that transsexual is actually replaced with the word transgender. Transsexual is kind of an outdated term now. That's why you can see the use of it kind of dwindling over the years. And this was done because trans people like Blaire and myself felt like the term transsexual carried a lot of sexual misconceptions about a trans identity that we were trying to move on from. But if you add in transgender, it really picks up where transsexual kind of dwindles down. And then if you add in non-binary with both of those, you can see that the searches for non-binary are actually way lower than the searches for transgender. So no, non-binary people have not taken over the trans community or taken over transsexual people. The thing that she is leaving out is that, like transsexuals, like Blaire and myself, non-binary people have always existed as well. The term non-binary may be new, but this idea of having a third gender or something like that, people like that have always existed. We can see like in the Oxford Dictionary back in I think 1995, the word non-binary was used to describe a gender identity. You can see on these transsexual forums back in the 90s that third identities and non-binary identities have always been acknowledged by the trans community. I will agree that the rates of trans acceptance among Americans has gone down since 2015, but I would not agree that it's because of trans people. I think that a very negative perception about us has been built by largely these right-wing creators. People aren't really getting their first exposure to a trans person in real life or, you know, with friends and family or with even people like me online who are actual trans people trying to tell you who they are. And, you know, maybe I should just say it now. She's blaming all of these things on trans people and trans rights movement for advocating for all of these different things, but the other side claims credit for taking these things away, right? These things were all strategically put together to create a massive case against trans people to progress, well, religious ideologues. Terry Schilling with the American Principles Project, a conservative think tank, helped bring transgender bathroom bills to the forefront. Schilling says his group considered legislation keeping gender identity out of civil rights laws or trans women out of domestic shelters, but nothing really clicked until a few years ago. Schilling says the trans sports bill opened the door for the legislation that followed. Policies restricting gender-affirming care for kids and limiting how gender is discussed in schools, and a return of bathroom bills. I don't think you could have done it by just focusing on the bathrooms. It would have been dead right now without the women's sports issue. This was not about legitimate concern. This was about creating a case against the trans rights movement. This was about creating a case against people like Blaire and people like me.
I am a transsexual. There's a medical basis for that. There's a scientific basis for that. And for non-binary, it's really not the case. I think that non-binary is more of a political term than anything else. If it comes down to conversations about trans people, I just wish actual transsexuals were having them, and oftentimes it's activists who are non-binary.
So here she's arguing that her identity of being a transsexual is more valid because it is based in science. It's based in, it's something in her DNA. It's something genetic, which, first of all, we don't know if that's true, right? There is no definitive proof that, you know, being trans is something that's in your DNA. But also, she doesn't know that there isn't a genetic factor to being non-binary as well. And regardless of that, who really cares, right? We shouldn't be, you know, nice and accepting to people because of their, you know, the scientific validity of their identity. We should just treat them with kindness and respect and accept them and support them, whatever, because that's who they say they are. We can see them in front of us and like they're a fucking person, right? It's the same thing for gay people, right? The gay rights movement didn't find success. We don't accept gay people simply because we found a scientific indicator that that's why they're gay and they have no choice and we just should accept them because it's just horrible for them. No, we just accept them because we realize that like everybody else, they're just people and there's no reason to not accept them. I want to talk about these other issues like trans bathrooms or trans sports or whatever you want to talk about. We can get there and we will in a minute, but supporting a non-binary person's identity has nothing to do with that. Nobody's saying you can't talk about the differences between a transsexual identity and a non-binary identity, but by definition, a non-binary person is trans. And you know, hey, Blaire can deny the history of non-binary identities throughout all these different cultures, but I mean, at that point, it's the pot calling the kettle black, right?
When the pronoun shit started happening, I remember people being pretty much universally dismissive that it would ever lead to any actual like societal problems or any issues. You could mostly just avoid anybody going by they, them, or any weird pronouns. And it was mostly on college campuses, and it mostly didn't matter. Until, of course, Bill C-16 in Canada came out, and suddenly there was an attempt to legislate people's speech. And pretty soon, the mainstream cultural expectation was that everyone had to respect everyone's pronouns, no matter how stupid they were, no matter how nonsensical they were at all times. And it was basically treated like you were saying the N-word or some shit if you did not, which is insane. Suddenly you could get fired at work for not respecting people's pronouns. We never had any official, you know, laws in the States like that as they did in Canada. However, I know multiple people who were fired for not respecting people's pronouns, no matter how stupid they were. It's a story I hear in emails and messages all of the time. People say he and she based on a subconscious assessment of the person they're interacting with's secondary sex characteristics. There's actually not much thought, any thought put into it. But suddenly, we all had to think about it all the time. And then suddenly you had a generation of people caught up in this ideological movement, this political movement of gender fluidity, non-binary, holding up their phones, having public freakouts all over social media.
Disgusting. I just went through the Taco Bell drive-thru. And do you know how they greeted me? They said, "Hello, ma'am." And then after handing me my food, said, Thank you, ma'am. Have a good day. Bitch, what about me says ma'am?
This is what the culture became. And it was all because of this tiny fringe group of just like complete freaks. And
First of all, rude. Okay, let me say this. Yes, pronouns are for the most part instinctual. So, if you come into a new job and your coworker walks by and accidentally misgenders you, no, they should not be fired from their job. However, calling somebody by a name or a pronoun or anything that they don't like repeatedly after being asked to not call them by that name, is harassment. Like that's just what it is. It doesn't matter if it has something to do with their gender or their weight or their economic status or whatever you want to bring up. You can't harass people at work. Okay, sorry. Even if you do believe it is biological truth to call someone a fatty, you should be fired. That's my opinion. Like, you don't have to believe trans people are really trans or they're the identity that they say they are. You just have to not harass people. Is that so hard? Is it so hard to not harass people? Oh my God, I guess so. As for the people complaining on TikTok about being misgendered, who fucking cares? You know what I mean? That's what social media is for, to talk about your life, to talk about the things that happen in your life to your friends or whatever. That seems pretty normal to me, right? It is very hurtful being misgendered. A lot of times for us, pre-transition selves are associated with a lot of pain, a lot of sadness. So bringing it up again is hurtful. Miss GameStop, though, that was a little wild. I'm not going to defend her. So to sum up this non-binary aspect of Blaire's video, let me just warn you, if you are somebody who is, a transsexual and is fed up with non-binary people taking over for us, history has never looked kindly upon people who don't fight for everybody in their community with the aim of protecting a select few. But we can think back to the idea of like the Lavender Menace, right? When Betty Friedan, the founder, the leader of NOW, spoke out against the inclusion of lesbians in the feminist movement because she feared that they would hold back feminism from reaching their goals. And we now understand that was not the case. That's not true. And that Betty Friedan, for doing this, was a little wrong, right? Maybe a lot wrong.
they mess with the kids. And how you do that, expecting to retain anybody's respect, is nuts. I need anybody confused as to how this all happened, that society has turned on trans people, to understand that any movement that even optically places itself as a threat to women or children is destined to fail, is destined to die, and honestly deserves to. It used to be one or two instances of underage trans people in small liberal countries, and then all of a sudden you had sex changes for minors in all 50 states. And I cannot stress enough that this is not how the issue was handled even at the start of my transition as early as 2015. And just how society was forced to universally get behind insane pronoun usage. Suddenly everyone had to be okay with sex changes for minors, with hormone therapy, with castration, chemical and otherwise, on underage people. Even as waves of detransitioners were going on the internet telling their stories about how they felt like their lives were ruined or their bodies were destroyed from these procedures as minors, it didn't matter how many people came forward talking about that. There was a complete suppression of that. There was a complete suppression of anybody who wanted to amplify those stories.
I agree that any movement that is, seen as going against kids is destined to die or destined to be challenged. That's exactly why people who have motivations to stop the progress of any civil rights movement have historically created propaganda claiming that these civil rights movements were going after the children. We saw this with the gay rights movement, and now we understand that gay people were never coming for the children, but rather it was actually fear-mongering that was trying to manipulate viewers into votes. But now the idea that trans kids used to be rare and now aren't, it's just not true. There has been a slight increase in the amount of people who have been, seeking out gender affirming care, but there has just not been as much of a change as people would like you to believe. When any group has been punished historically for having certain traits, they have tended to hide those traits, right? Makes sense. Survival of the fittest. We saw this with even things like left-handedness, right? Back when being left-handed was something that was punished in schools, there wasn't a lot of people who, used their left hand, who were left-handed. But once that was no longer the norm to punish people for using their left hand, the amount of people who, were left-handed rose up in a very similar way to the number of people who are coming out as trans. It's the same thing with trans people. Now that we're not being punished for being trans and not being bullied and harassed for being trans, more people are coming out as trans. Once again, we have an issue, this time trans kids, that has been completely politicized by not the trans community, but anti-trans activists. The fact is, people that are perpetuating these false narratives want you to believe that trans surgeries are happening to kids every single day. Every other surgery is a trans surgery happening to a minor, and that's just not the case.
How many people have had this done?
Depends on what
I don't think we have exact numbers, but if we're talking about the drugs, millions.
You're talking about hormone blockers.
Yeah.
Millions of
blockers
kids have been on hormone blockers? Really?
I'm sure someone's going to fact check me on that, but my guess is that we're into the millions now at this point. Yeah, that would be my guess. I actually think that this shouldn't be happening to.
It says over the last 5 years, there were at least 4,780 adolescents who started puberty blockers and had a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis.
It says it's kind of undercounted, but
that would be a big
less than
undercounting.
1,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess hundreds of thousands at this, but I could be wrong.
Million sounds great.
Yeah.
There are studies that show that trans surgery is extremely rare, even for adults. For minors, it's much, much more rare. And the gag is the procedures that minors do sometimes have that can be qualified as gender affirming care, like top surgery, for example, are surgeries that cis minors are having as well. Minor cis boys have breast tissue removed at actually a much higher rate than trans boys do. Same thing with hormones and puberty blockers. These treatments are actually given in a much higher proportion to cisgender people. Honestly, the trans kid issue makes me the most upset out of any of the issues that we see happening right now. The amount of trans kids that I've met that just want to be happy, just want to feel comfortable in their bodies, who without gender affirming care may not be here, is heartbreaking. I talk to parents all the time, especially right now, who are terrified that their child's mental health is going to return to its deteriorated state because their gender affirming care is being taken away. And also, aren't these people, the people that are opposing all of this, typically the people that believe in small, limited government? Taking away a parent's right to choose what medicine that their child is able to receive is not small government. That's not limited government. Trans medicine, even for minors, is not new. One example that she brought up to show that it's, exploding and it's all kids everywhere now after this 2015 explosion is Jazz Jennings, who transitioned how long ago? Like 20 years ago? Way before any of this. I obviously do not think that all minors should be transitioning. I think that every single minor that desires to transition should go through a full medical process, including a team of medical professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, endocrinologists, the whole team, to do their best to ensure that this is the right move for this child. When I started my transition, I technically was a minor. I was 17 years old, and so I had to prove that I had gender dysphoria that was consistent, persistent, and insistent, meaning it was not going to be going away. I had to bring in photos that showed that this gender dysphoria was present throughout my entire life. I had to tell this team of professionals the ways that it was affecting my quality of life and affecting my ability to reintegrate into society. And by the way, that is taking into account the stories of detransitioners, right? The stories that say that they didn't get the proper medical treatment before they transitioned and, they wish they had dug into their comorbidities and stuff like that more beforehand. I believe in all of that. But what I think the people who are parading around these detransitioners really want us to think is that there is no effective form of transition, is that every single person who transitions will eventually end up like these detransitioners and regret it. That is not the case.
We have 19 states that have passed laws to protect women's sports, to keep boys out. Tennessee, Bill Lee, just became the 9th state in the country to ban these surgeries and hormone treatments for minors. And so they're freaking out. And one of the things I saw recently, there are 2 activists that come to mind. They're both transgender, so they're males, but they try and, do women face.
For the vast majority of trans people, including trans minors, transitioning is the only way to live a happy, comfortable life. These treatments like hormone replacement therapy have been around for decades and have been shown to be extremely effective at lowering rates of depression and anxiety and suicidality and increasing quality of life. This is a mental health condition that Blaire herself has claimed she suffered through her entire life that we have a treatment for. Trans people should not have to suffer through watching their bodies develop in a way that does not align with who they are. I think for the majority of people, if you're a cis man out there and you started developing breasts, it would be very, very uncomfortable for you. So not only does providing treatment assist with those discomfortable feelings, but it also allows trans people to avoid the expensive, painful, and time-consuming process of going through transition surgeries.
And then it got to the point where it wasn't just the kids on the operating table that were being messed with. It was every kid in every public school in every state. Queer theory, gender ideology was suddenly being taught in all of these schools. There was all this propaganda around it. Suddenly you were seeing trans cartoons, trans kids characters.
T stands for trans or transgender.
Ooh, that's a cool new word.
Definitely, Teddy.
This really upset parents, and it upset everyone, even that weren't parents, but understood that this was something strange. This was something wrong. This was clearly indoctrination. It wasn't just teaching tolerance and acceptance. When you're asking every student what their pronouns are, when you're introducing every student to all of the 1,000 genders you've invented, to all of the 1,000 pronouns and ways to identify, and you're making it fun and colorful and like it's a little quiz, you are trying to actively make kids gay or trans. Not to mention the flooding of explicit books being put in public schools, some of them depicting sex acts or talking about gay sex acts that suddenly were in the libraries for all students to pick up and read. A book called This Book is Gay. What an amazing cover. You ban it and it has the word gay in it. In my caveman brain, that means you do not like gay people. Right, because you're a simpleton. The reality is the book has a glossary that teaches kids about kinks.
You know, some of these books are a little bit intense for me as well. I'll just admit that. But unfortunately, the reasoning for having these books is understandable. Districts that voted to keep these books in their libraries, so again, not part of the curriculum, just in the school's libraries, voted to do so because they feared that not having these books be accessible to young people in their schools would lead those young people to search out the information they're looking for online. Personally, I would much rather a young person who is exploring their identity look to books in a school library that, you know, maybe they are discussing kinks that are a little bit intense, but at least they're not watching, you know, graphic hardcore porn online. At least they're not going on Grindr and meeting predatory men at, 12 years old. Especially in districts that don't have comprehensive sex ed that include, gay people and trans people. Gay youth really have nowhere else to look for the questions that they are undoubtedly having besides online. And I mean, we all know the internet is a dark place that a lot of times is not somewhere that children should be exploring. I mean, personally, first of all, I just don't see an issue with acknowledging that trans or non-binary people exist, even in a kid's show. I think that it's a good thing to teach young people that there are people who are different than them. The argument against it is that, one, it will turn kids trans or turn kids non-binary if they see this on their TV shows, which is, again, a reused argument from the anti-gay movement that being gay or being trans is a choice that we get to make. It is not. It's who we are. A TV show cannot make somebody trans. It cannot make somebody gay. But again, even with her citing detransition numbers, she's ignoring so many facts. Trans and non-binary people are still vastly underrepresented in media, despite the 2 cartoons that she showed. Now she's moving on to trans athletes. Okay, let's keep it moving.
Similar to, like I said, that if a movement positions itself even just optically as a threat to children, that it's a wrap, it's doomed, it's going to fail. It's the same as when you mess with women. And the concept of trans women in women's sports was, again, something that was just not around when I first started. I mean, it's comical, it's clownery when you look at any video of it happening.
Okay, so again, that's not true. The Olympics started allowing trans women to compete in women's sports in 2004. Trans people being allowed in women's sports did not spark this debate. It was people who were trying to stop the progress of trans rights.
This was probably the easiest thing to debunk as being fair or normal or something that people should accept, right? Just the basic biological differences between males and females. You can just run the list, the long list of reasons, and yet you were forced to accept this. You were forced to accept this all the way from middle schools and high schools that suddenly had trans kids on just the local sports team to universities to actual professional sports. And when I think of the topic of trans women and women's sports and how that really turned society off, go figure, it's hard not to think of Fallon Fox, who literally cracked a woman's skull.
Again, unfortunately, a lot of this is just simply not true. Everybody loves to blame trans activists for this. We didn't make these decisions, okay? The decision to allow trans people in sports was made by sports scientists and sports professionals because of the substantial effect that hormone replacement therapy has on a transgender woman's athletic performance. Most of a male's athletic advantage comes from their testosterone levels. Once that's reduced for a certain amount of time, studies point towards athletic performance being more on par with a cisgender counterpart. I will admit that studies on trans athletes are limited right now, but I'm not a sports professional. I want to trust the sports professionals and leave it to them. Anybody who looks at myself or Blaire White and says that we have the athletic ability of a cisgender man is... Listen, I'm a strong girl. I go to the gym multiple times a week, but And secondly, Blaire has really twisted the reality of a lot of these cases. So it's a little hard to meaningfully engage with it because it's just fucking not true. But let me tell you how it's not true. Firstly, the NCAA has reported less than 10 trans athletes out of 510,000 athletes. So we're not dominating sports by any means. The Olympic weightlifter that she showed didn't win. And even the most jarring example that she provided of Fallon Fox is just simply not true. Fox says she has never fractured an opponent's skull, but has caused an orbital bone fracture in the past. She added that cisgender women fighters commonly cause orbital fractures during MMA fights. It is very easy to break and happens often in the MMA. But of course, Blaire frames this incredibly common situation that happens by cisgender individuals all the time as a trans woman cracking the skull of a vulnerable cisgender woman who's fighting in the MMA.
Another, of course, honorary mention is Leah Thomas, which is definitely gonna go. Y'all wanna act like Blaire White is the reason why anything bad is happening to trans people. Take that up with Leah Thomas's big ass, please. Please. If you have more words for Blaire White for voting in a way that you don't like, I'm gonna need some words spared for Leah Thomas, who set back trans acceptance easily 10 years.
The cattiness is too much. She's giving, no, never mind, I'm not gonna say it. For Leah Thomas, yes, she won her race, but what Blaire isn't telling you is that she actually had a slower time than the cisgender female who swam the same race in 2024, and Leah never even broke the record. Leah's time was not out of the norm, and she followed the rules. But again, for her to blame trans activists and, trans sports players for following their dream and competing according to the rules is misplaced. If you have concerns over the fairness of trans women in women's sports, you can advocate for better studies, but attacking trans women just because of the way that they look is that doesn't really help anything.
And if you were wondering if there were any other corners of society that this ideology could try to reconstruct, change, and or infiltrate, you probably weren't surprised when it got down to prisons, when it got down to males in women's prisons.
Really quick, that trans person on the screen that impregnated 2 female victims, it was consensual sex. This bitch is against consensual sex. I'm sorry.
Adam Graham was a predator who abused vulnerable women, a double rapist who attacked victims in their own homes. And this is the same person, now known as Isla Bryson, a transition made after they were arrested. When they were initially...
Yeah, no, that's where I draw the line. She's not allowed in. Like, I'll call you she, her, whatever, babe, but you can't do that. You can't do that. That's I agree. No, you can't come in, girl. Safety should be the priority, especially for vulnerable people in prison. So some of these people, no, you should not be allowed to room with women or have access to the general population of women. No. Maybe that means if you're somebody who transitions after you're sent to prison and maybe you committed some of these violent crimes and maybe you have to be kept somewhere else, somewhere separate, that's fine. Whatever, we can talk about that. However, that is not what's happening right now. The executive orders, the first one that Trump came out with would put all trans women prisoners into men's prisons. Regardless of when they transitioned, their surgical status, their medical status, whatever you want to say. I mean, that's literally what you're advocating against, right? Putting vulnerable women into populations of dangerous men. There have been reports that have come out that have talked about how trans women are often placed into units with the most violent offenders in men's prisons to keep these violent offenders orderly. There's reports of sexual harassment and violence against trans women from even correctional officers. These blanket rulings that Blaire is now defending and saying that we deserve would put her in a men's prison. It may keep, people like this out, but it puts us in danger too. This executive order is not the answer. All right, we are finally at the last aspect that Blaire has brought up for this video.
Bathrooms. If you were to listen to the trans activists, you would think that it wasn't until 2015, 2016 that society even knew how to engage in public restrooms politely and how to just do their business and go in a way that wasn't problematic. And here I was watching the first bathroom bills be signed into law saying, whoever had an issue with a bathroom?
Wait, trans people are the ones that said that trans people don't know how to use the bathroom?
Even transsexuals. I'm looking around at no issues ever. And suddenly you had liberals still caking off the money from the gay rights era, from all the money they raised for gay marriage, didn't know what to do with it, had to go try to solve a legal problem that didn't even exist. And what does that do? It pisses people off.
That is a crazy claim to not even try to prove that trans people are the ones that started, advocating and pushing bills for allowing trans people in the bathroom. That's not true. She's the only one that thinks this, right? Like I said before, Terry Schilling, and people like Terry Schilling, I mean, he's not the only one, are very vocal about the fact that they did this on purpose, that they started with the bathroom bills, realized that it wasn't successful, and so went on to the other issues that she mentioned today to create an entire case to stop the progress of the trans rights movement because it did not align with their family values. Terry Schilling is the president of the American Principles Project. He has overseen growth into the premier national organization, Defending the Family in Politics. He has directed numerous election efforts, including campaigns to make defending women's sports and protecting parental rights in education key Republican issues. To them, it's about their pro-family values and getting candidates that they want to win to win.
Scott Wagner sponsored a transgender bathroom bill that forces business owners to let men into women's showers and bathrooms or be shut down for following their religious beliefs. We just can't trust Scott Wagner.
The bill being talked about in this video, of course, is not a bathroom bill, as Blaire tries to suggest, but the Equality Act, which protected LGBTQ individuals from discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodation, education, and other areas. But here's the really telling thing. Scott Wagner did not even support trans people using the bathroom according to their gender identity. It was all for political marketing and to, as their website says, push their religion into other people's daily lives. We look at the media bias / fact check for American Principles Project. They are rated as extremely right. They are rated low for factuality, and they received a questionable score, meaning that they have one or more of the following: extreme bias, consistent promotion of propaganda and conspiracies, poor or no sourcing to credible information, a complete lack of transparency, and or is fake news. They claimed credit for this. So for her to try to blame trans people and say that like trans people started it when, I mean, even her own side is like, we did it, y'all. And like without a single shred of evidence is just, well, you know what it is. But you know, this is where Blaire's grift comes in. She cannot acknowledge the wrongdoings of her own side, which is a little weird considering they've been, you know, plotting against people like her and anybody that goes against their pro-family values for years now. But then she says that life was better for trans people before all of this, you know, when she first transitioned.
I'm of the opinion, maybe it's a bit controversial, that things were actually much better for trans people when nobody knew what the fuck they were. When people didn't really know the topic and there was never really any issues.
Let me say, I transitioned at the same time as Blaire back in 2015, and it was not better. I mean, maybe it was better than right now, you know, after the Trump administration has come into play, but it was definitely not better than, you know, compared to a few years ago. And unfortunately, a lot of newly transitioned people don't really understand this because they only have the last few years in their sight. They don't remember when trans people couldn't hold jobs because we didn't have non-discrimination protections in employment, when people couldn't find housing because they didn't have non-discrimination protections for housing. The reality is, if you were not rich, white, and able-bodied, you had a very, very hard time even accessing gender-affirming care. And another reality is, if you were not perfectly passable to the point where nobody could even tell that you were trans, life was extremely difficult. And I'm not speaking on my own behalf because obviously I've had a lot of privilege in my life and in my transition. But if you speak to other trans people, they'll tell you. They'll tell you that they couldn't get a job because there was no non-discrimination protections in employment. They'll tell you that they couldn't find access to the medications that they needed because doctors were expensive and hard to find. So no, maybe Blaire never had to ask for help, but a lot of people did. And now we're seeing a regression of rights back to what it was like before 2015. First executive order removes gender identity from the government completely, removing non-discrimination protections for trans people. I mean, it doesn't. It attempts to remove non-discrimination protections, but, you know, constitutionally, it is not allowed to do that, so that's why it's being challenged. But that's what he's trying to do. Send us back to a time where it was too difficult for the majority of us to transition. She was right when she says that there were virtually no problems in bathrooms before all of this, but she's wrong in identifying who started this.
So where do we go from here? People are probably not going to want to hear this, but I personally feel like the community deserves the cultural backlash happening. The community and its activists were acting as cultural poisons for at least a decade, and a healthy society is going to push back. It just is what it is. Short of any, like I said before, any violence, anything unconstitutional, anything that happens is actually going to be your fault. From now on, it needs to be 18 and older, yes. That's my personal opinion. I know a lot of people say it needs to be in their 20s or whatever. I personally feel like if you can die for your country at 18, you can do what you want as far as elective surgeries. But until the community stops fighting for kids to receive these treatments or stop letting the activists argue for this issue on their behalf, it's never going to be okay. Drop the trans women and women's sports as well. Create trans leagues. It's very simple. It's another thing I've been screaming forever. Quite frankly, everyone wants me to speak on, Trump's moves in the first few weeks of his new administration and the things that he's done towards gender ideology and trans people. And again, I feel like they're deserved. And if you really want to nail them down one by one, what are the things that people are so upset about? I personally respect that he went on air saying that trans surgery for minors is not okay and that trans surgeries going forward are going to be performed very rarely. It should be rare. It should not be treated as some blanket treatment for anybody and everybody that comes into one of these godforsaken gender clinics that have no standards of care.
No standards of care is just not true. There are extensive standards of care for trans people that have been approved the same way that the standards of care for depression, anxiety, diabetes have been approved. I don't know why she feels like this particular form of medicine needs to have a more aggressive standard of care. But also she's contradicting herself. She says that anybody over 18 should be able to access, the elective surgeries that they want, but then also says that it should be rare and that informed consent should not be a thing for adults. In my opinion, adults should be able to make an informed decision about whether or not they go on hormones or whether or not they have treatments. I think it's a good idea to go through gender therapy and make sure that it is actually, like gender dysphoria that's making you feel like you want to transition. That's my opinion. I don't think that we should enforce that for a lot of reasons.
Second of all, removing X from people's passports. I don't know why y'all think that it's some sort of own on me, like, oh, look what he's doing now. Did you think I had an X on my passport? You bobblehead bitch. Did you think I had an X on my passport and I'm tripping that I can't be Azizer anymore? Because that's really not.
Again, she's wrong. The executive order that she's referring to does not just take away a non-binary person's ability to use an X on their passport. It takes away the ability for all trans people to change their gender marker, including Blaire. Right? We saw Hunter Schafer had her gender marker changed on her passport back to male, and arguably she's much more passable than Blaire. And myself. I'll say myself too.
I put female, and when it was picked up today and I opened it up, they had changed the marker to male.
People who have gone through a full surgical transition, who have bottom surgery, who have top surgery, who have had facial feminization, are having their gender markers changed to male. This does affect Blaire and binary transsexuals like Blaire. She's lying. That's pretty much it for her video. Let me give you some of my final thoughts. At the end of the day, trans people are not to blame for what's happening, okay? Do I think that trans people should, maybe reconsider their strategy when it comes to reaching across the table and developing that connection with people that leads to acceptance? Yeah, I do. We as a community need to be less reactive, we need to be less conversational, and we need to be a lot smarter about where we spend our time and our energy. Trans people, just like everybody else, are not perfect. The community is not perfect. Strongly believe that we are fighting with the best of intentions in mind, with the safety and security of everybody, including women and children, in mind. And so while I do say that maybe we should recalibrate or adjust our path forward, I will not be conceding on any of these issues. And my advice to trans people out there is to not concede either. Their goals right now are to have us comply in advance, to give up on our transitions, to go back into the closet. Do not give them that. We know who we are. We know our intentions are pure, and we know we have the safety of everybody in mind. So do not comply in advance. Listen to the concerns of people around you, of your neighbors, and people you may not typically agree with, but stand your ground as well. A lot of people like Blaire are trying to make it seem like the only way forward for the trans community is to give up on ourselves, to give up on our youngest members of our community. That's not the way forward. That's pretty much it for this video. If you are somebody that's come from Blaire's video and you've made it this long, thank you for hearing me out. I hope I was able to provide some sort of alternate perspective for you today. If not, that's okay too. I'll get you next time. But yeah, you guys, thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already and you would like to be, go ahead and do that right now. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video, okay? Bye everyone.